Historians are not agreed upon the origin and meaning of the famous name of Rome, which is so celebrated through all the world. Some relate that the Pelasgi, after wandering over the greater part of the world, and conquering most nations, settled there, and gave the city its name from their own strength in battle. Others tell us that after the capture of Troy, some fugitives obtained ships, were carried by the wind to the Tyrrhenian or Tuscan coast, and cast anchor in the Tiber. There the women, who had suffered much from the sea voyage, were advised by one who was accounted chief among them for wisdom and noble birth, Roma by name, to burn the ships. At first the men were angry at this, but afterwards, being compelled to settle round the Palatine Hill, they fared better than they expected, as they found the country fertile and the neighbors hospitable. So they paid great honor to Roma, and called the city after her name. From this circumstance, they say, arose the present habit of women kissing their male relatives and connections, because those women, after they had burned the ships, thus embraced and caressed the men, trying to pacify their rage. Some say that Roma, who gave the name to the city, was the daughter of Italus in Lucaria, or of Telephus, the son of Hercules, and the wife of Aeneas, while others say that she was the daughter of Ascanius, the son of Aeneas. Others relate that Romanus, the son of Odysseus and Circe, founded the city, or that it was Romus, the son of Himethyon, who was sent from Troy by Diomedes. Or Romus, the despot of the Latins, who drove out of his kingdom the Tyrrhenians, who, starting from Thessaly, had made their way to Lydia, and thence to Italy. And even those who follow the most reasonable of these legends, and admit that it was Romulus who founded the city after his own name, do not agree about his birth, for some say that he was the son of Aeneas, and Dexithia, the daughter of Phorbas, and with his brother Romus was brought to Italy when a child, and that as the river was in flood, all the other boats were swamped, but that in which the children was carried to a soft bank, and miraculously preserved, from which the name of Rome was given to the place. Others say that Roma, the daughter of that Trojan lady, married Latinus, the son of Telemachus, and bore a son, Romulus, while others say that his mother was Aemilia, the daughter of Aeneas and Lavinia, by an intrigue with Mars, while others give a completely legendary account of his birth as follows. In the house of Tarchetius, the king of the Albani, a cruel and lawless man, a miracle took place. A male figure arose from the hearth and remained there for many days. Now there was in Etruria an oracle of Tethys, which told Tarchetius that a virgin must be offered to the figure, for there should be born of her a son surpassing all mankind in strength, valor, and good fortune. Tarchetius hereupon explained the oracle to one of his daughters, and ordered her to give herself up to the figure. But she, not liking to do so, sent her servant maid instead. Tarchetius, when he learned this, was greatly incensed, and cast them both into prison, meaning to put them to death. However, in a dream, Vesta appeared to him, forbidding him to slay them. In consequence of this, he locked them up with a loom, telling them that when they had woven the piece of work upon it, they should be married. So they wove all day, and during the night other maidens, sent by Tarchetius, undid their work again. Now when the servant maid was delivered of twins, Tarchetius gave them to one Taratius, and bade him destroy them. He laid them down near the river, and there they were suckled by a she-wolf, while all sorts of birds brought them morsels of food, until one day a cowherd saw them. Filled with wonder, he ventured to come up to the children and bear them off. Saved from death in this manner, they grew up, and then attacked and slew Tarchetius. This is the legend given by one Promathion, the compiler of a history of Italy. But the most credible story, and that has the most vouchers for its truth, is that which was first published in Greece by Diocles of Peparethios, a writer whom Fabius Pictor has followed in most points. There are variations in this legend also, but generally speaking, it runs as follows. The dynasty established by Aeneas at Alba Longa came down to two brothers, Numitor and Amulius. Amulius offered his brother the choice between the sovereign power and the royal treasure, including the gold brought from Troy. Numitor chose the sovereign power, but Amulius, possessing all the treasure, and thereby having more power than his brother, easily dethroned him, and, as he feared his brother's daughter might have children who would avenge him, he made her a priestess of Vesta, sworn to celibacy forever. This lady is named by some Ilia, by others Rhea or Silvia. After no long time she was found to be with child, against the law of the Vestals. Her life was saved by the entreaties of Antho, the king's daughter, but she was closely imprisoned, that she might not be delivered without Amulius's knowledge. She bore 2 children of remarkable beauty and size, and Amulius, all the more alarmed at this, bade an attendant take them and expose them. Some say that this man's name was Faustulus, while others say that this was not his name, but that of their rescuer. However, he placed the infants in a cradle, and went down to the river with the intention of throwing them into it, but seeing it running strong and turbulently, he feared to approach it, laid down the cradle near the bank, and went away. The river, which was in flood, rose, and gently floated off the cradle, and carried it down to a soft place which is now called Kermalus, but anciently, it seems, was called Germanus, because brothers are called Germani. Near this place was a fig tree, which they called Ruminalius, either from Romulus, as most persons imagine, or because cattle came to ruminate in its shade, or, more probably, because of the suckling of the children there, for the ancients called the nipple Ruma. Moreover, they call the goddess who appears to have watched over the children Rumilia, and to her they sacrifice offerings without wine, and pour milk as a libation upon her altar. It is said that, while the infants were lying in this place, the she-wolf suckled them, and that a woodpecker came and helped to feed and watch over them. Now these animals are sacred to the god Mars, and the Latins have a peculiar reverence and worship for the woodpecker. These circumstances, therefore, did not a little to confirm the tale of the mother of the children, that their father was Mars, though some say that she was deceived by Amulius himself, who, after condemning her to a life of virginity, appeared before her dressed in armor and ravished her. Others say that the twofold meaning of the name of their nurse gave rise to this legend, for the Latins used the word lupa for she-wolves, and also for unchaste women, as was the wife of Faustulus, who brought up the children, Acca Laurentia by name. To her also the Romans offer sacrifice, and in the month of April the priest of Mars brings libations to her, and the feast is called Laurentia. The Romans also worship another Laurentia for this reason. The priest of Hercules, weary with idleness, proposed to the god to cast the dice on the condition that, if he won, he should receive something good from the god, while if he lost, he undertook to provide the god with a bountiful feast, and a fair woman to take his pleasure with. Upon these conditions he cast the dice, first for the god, and then for himself, and was beaten. Wishing to settle his wager properly, and making a point of keeping his word, he prepared a feast for the god, and hired Laurentia, then in the pride of her beauty, though not yet famous. He feasted her in the temple, where he had prepared a couch, and after supper he locked her in, that the god might possess her. And indeed the god is said to have appeared to the lady, and to have bidden her go early in the morning into the marketplace, and to embrace the first man she met, and make him her friend. There met her a citizen far advanced in years, possessing a fair income, childless, and unmarried. His name was Tarutius. He took Laurentia to himself, and loved her, and upon his death left her heiress to a large and valuable property, the greater part of which she left by will to the city. It is related of her that, after she had become famous, and was thought to enjoy the favor of heaven, she vanished near the very same spot where the other Laurentia lay buried. This place is now called Velabrum, because during the frequent overflowings of the river, people used there to be ferried over to the marketplace. Now they call ferrying Velatura. Some say that the road from the marketplace to the circus, starting from this point, used to be covered with sails or awnings by those who treated the people to a spectacle, and in the Latin tongue a sail is called velum. This is why the second Laurentia is honored by the Romans. Now Faustulus, the swineherd of Amulius, kept the children concealed from everyone, though some say that Numitor knew of it, and shared the expense of their education. They were sent to Gabii to learn their letters, and everything else that well-born children should know, and they were called Romulus and Remus, because they were first seen suckling the wolf. Their noble birth showed itself while they were yet children, in their size and beauty, and when they grew up they were manly and high-spirited, of invincible courage and daring. Romulus, however, was thought the wiser and more politic of the two, and in his discussions with the neighbors about pasture and hunting gave them opportunities of noting that his disposition was one which led him to command rather than to obey. On account of these qualities they were beloved by their equals in the poor, but they despised the king's officers and bailiffs as being no braver than themselves, and cared neither for their anger nor their threats. They led the lives and followed the pursuits of nobly born men, not valuing sloth and idleness, but exercise and hunting, defending the land against brigands, capturing plunderers, and avenging those who had suffered wrong, and thus they became famous. Now a quarrel arose between the herdsmen of Numitor and those of Amulius, and cattle were driven off by the former. Amulius's men, enraged at this, fought and routed the others, and recovered a great part of the booty. They cared nothing for Numitor's anger, but collected together many needy persons and slaves, and filled them with a rebellious spirit. While Romulus was absent at a sacrifice, for he was much addicted to sacrifices and divination, the herdsmen of Numitor fell in with Remus, accompanied by a small band, and fought with him. After many wounds had been received on both sides, Numitor's men conquered and took Remus alive. Remus was brought before Numitor, who did not punish him, as he feared his brother's temper, but went to his brother and begged for justice, saying that he had suffered wrong at the hands of the king, his brother's servants. As all the people of Alba sympathized with Remus, and feared that he would be unjustly put to death, or worse, Amulius, alarmed at them, handed over Remus to his brother Numitor to deal with as he pleased. Numitor took him, and as soon as he reached home, after admiring the bodily strength and stature of the youth, which surpassed all the rest, perceiving in his looks his courage and fiery spirit, undismayed by his present circumstances, and having heard that his deeds corresponded to his appearance, and above all, as seems probable, some god being with him and watching over the first beginnings of great events, he was struck by the idea of asking him to tell the truth as to who he was and how he was born, giving him confidence and encouragement by his kindly voice and looks. The young man boldly said, "I will conceal nothing from you, for you seem more like a king than Amulius. You hear and judge before you punish, but he gives men up to be punished without a trial. Formerly we, for we are twins, understood that we were the sons of Faustulus and Laurentia, the king's servants. But now that we are brought before you as culprits, and are falsely accused and in danger of our lives, we have heard great things about ourselves. Whether they be true or not, we must now put to the test. Our birth is said to be a secret, and our nursing and bringing up is yet stranger, for we were cast out to the beasts and the birds, and were fed by them, suckled by a she-wolf, and fed with morsels of food by a woodpecker as we lay in our cradle beside the great river. Our cradle still exists, carefully preserved, bound with brazen bands, on which is an indistinct inscription, which hereafter will serve as a means by which we may be recognized by our parents, but to no purpose if we are dead." Numitor, considering the young man's story, and reckoning up the time from his apparent age, willingly embraced the hope which was dawning on his mind, and considered how he might obtain a secret interview with his daughter, and tell her of all this, for she was still kept a close secret. Faustulus, when he heard of Remus being captured and delivered up to Numitor, called upon Romulus to help him, and told him plainly all about his birth, although previously he had hinted so much that any one who paid attention to his words might have known nearly all about it, and he himself with the cradle ran to Numitor full of hopes and fears, now that matters had come to a critical point. He was viewed with suspicion by the guards at the king's gate, and while they were treating him contemptuously and confusing him by questions, they espied the cradle under his cloak. Now it chanced that one of them had been one of those who had taken the children to cast them away, and had been present when they were abandoned. This man, seeing the cradle and recognizing it by its make and the inscription on it, suspected the truth, and at once told the king and brought the man in to be examined. Faustulus, in those dire straits, did not altogether remain unshaken, and yet did not quite allow his secret to be wrung from him. He admitted that the boys were alive, but said that they were living far away from Alba, and that he himself was bringing the cradle to Ilia, who had often longed to see and touch it to confirm her belief in the life of her children. Now Romulus did what men generally do when excited by fear or rage. He sent in a great hurry one who was a good man and a friend of Numitor, bidding him ask Numitor whether he had heard anything about the survival of the children. This man, on arrival, finding Numitor all but embracing Remus, confirmed his belief that he was his grandson, and bade him take his measures quickly, remaining by him himself to offer assistance. Even had they wished it, there was no time to delay, for Romulus was already near, and no small number of the citizens, though through hatred and fear of Romulus, were going out to join him. He himself brought no small force, arrayed in companies of 100 each. Each of these was led by a man who carried a bundle of sticks and straw upon a pole. The Latins call these manipla, and from this these companies are even at the present day called maniples in the Roman army. Now as Remus raised a revolt within, while Romulus assailed the place without, the despot was captured and put to death without having been able to do anything, or take any measures for his own safety. The greater part of the above story is told by Fabius Pictor and Diocles of Peparethos, who seem to have been the first historians of the foundation of Rome. The story is doubted by many on account of its theatrical and artificial form, yet we ought not to disbelieve it when we consider what wondrous works are wrought by chance, and when, too, we reflect on the Roman Empire, which, had it not had a divine origin, never could have arrived at its present extent. After the death of Romulus and the reorganization of the kingdom, the twins, who would not live in Alba as subjects, and did not wish to reign there during the life of their grandfather, gave up the sovereign power to him, and having made a suitable provision for their mother, determined to dwell by themselves, and to found a city in the parts in which they themselves had been reared. At least, this is the most probable of the various reasons which are given. It may also have been necessary, as many slaves and fugitives had gathered round them, either that they should disperse these men and so lose their entire power, or else go and dwell alone amongst them. It is clear from the rape of the Sabine woman that the citizens of Alba would not admit these outcasts into their own body, since that deed was caused, not by wanton insolence, but by necessity, as they could not obtain wives by fair means. For after carrying the women off, they treated them with the greatest respect. Afterwards, when the city was founded, they made it a sanctuary for people in distress to take refuge in, saying that it belonged to the god Acilus, and they received in it all sorts of persons, not giving up slaves to their masters, debtors to their creditors, or murderers to their judges, but saying that, in accordance with a Pythian oracle, the sanctuary was free to all. So that the city soon became full of men, for they say that at first it contained no less than 1,000 hearths. Of this more hereafter. When they were proceeding to found the city, they at once quarreled about its site. Romulus fixed upon what is now called Roma Quadrata, a square piece of ground, and wished the city to be built in that place, but Remus preferred a strong position on Mount Aventino, which in memory of him was called Rimonium, and is now called Rignarium. They agreed to decide their dispute by watching the flights of birds, and having taken their seats apart, it is said that 6 vultures appeared to Remus, and afterwards twice as many to Romulus. Some say that Remus really saw his vultures, but that Romulus only pretended to have seen them, and when Remus came to him, then the 12 appeared to Romulus, for which reason the Romans at the present day draw their auguries especially from vultures. Herodorus of Pontus says that Hercules delighted in the sight of a vulture, when about to do any great action. It is the most harmless of all creatures, for it injures neither crops, fruit, nor cattle, and lives entirely upon dead corpses. It does not kill or injure anything that has life, and even abstains from dead birds from its relationship to them. Now eagles and owls and falcons peck and kill other birds in spite of Aeschylus's line, "Bird eating bird polluted air must be." Moreover, the other birds are, so to speak, ever before our eyes, and continually remind us of their presence. But the vulture is seldom seen, and it is difficult to meet with its young, which has suggested to some persons the strange idea that vultures come from some other world to pay us their rare visits, which are like those occurrences which, according to the soothsayers, do not happen naturally or spontaneously, but by the interposition of heaven. When Remus discovered the deceit, he was very angry, and while Romulus was digging a trench round where the city wall was to be built, he jeered at the works and hindered them. At last, as he jumped over it, he was struck dead either by Romulus himself or by Celer, one of his companions. In this fight Faustulus was slain, and also Pleistinius, who is said to have been Faustulus's brother, and to have helped him in rearing Romulus and his brother. Celer retired into Rhenea, and from him the Romans call quick, sharp men Celeres. Quintus Metellus, who, when his father died, in a very few days exhibited a show of gladiators, was surnamed Celer by the Romans in their wonder at the short time he had spent in his preparations. Romulus, after burying Remus and his foster parents in the Romurium, consecrated his city, having fetched men from Etruria, who taught him how to perform it according to sacred rites and ceremonies, as though they were celebrating holy mysteries. A trench was dug in a circle round what is now called the Comitium, and into it were flung first fruits of all those things which are honorable and necessary for men. Finally, each man brought a little of the earth of the country from which he came, and flung it into one heap and mixed it all together. They call this pit by the same name as the heavens, Mundus. Next they drew the outline of the city in the form of a circle, with this place as its center. And then the founder, having fitted a plough with a brazen plowshare, and yoked it to a bull and an ox and a cow, himself ploughs a deep furrow round the boundaries. It is the duty of his attendants to throw the clods inwards, which the plough turns up, and to let none of them fall outwards. By this line they define the extent of the fortifications, and it is called by contraction Pomerium, which means behind the walls or beyond the walls, Postminia. Wherever they intend to place a gate, they take off the plowshare, and carry the plough over, leaving a space. After this ceremony, they consider the entire wall sacred, except the gates. But if they were sacred also, they could not without scruple bring in and out necessaries and unclean things through them. It is agreed that the foundation of the city took place on the 11th day before the calends of May, and on this day the Romans keep a festival which they call the birthday of the city. At this feast, originally, we are told, they sacrificed nothing that has life, but thought it right to keep the anniversary of the birth of the city pure and unpolluted by blood. However, before the foundation of the city, they used to keep a pastoral feast called Palilia. The Roman months at the present day do not in any way correspond to those of Greece, yet they, the Greeks, distinctly affirm that the day upon which Romulus founded the city was the 30th of the month. The Greeks likewise tell us that on that day an eclipse of the sun took place, which they think was that observed by Antimachus of Teos, the epic poet, which occurred in the 3rd year of the 6th Olympiad. In the time of Varro the philosopher, who of all the Romans was most deeply versed in Roman history, there was one Terutius, a companion of his, a philosopher and mathematician, who had especially devoted himself to the art of casting nativities, and was thought to have attained great skill therein. To this man Varro proposed the task of finding the day and hour of Romulus's birth, basing his calculations on the influence which the stars were said to have had upon his life, just as geometricians solve their problems by the analytic method, for it belongs, he argued, to the same science to predict the life of a man from the time of his birth, and to find the date of a man's birth if the incidents of his life are given. Terutius performed his task, and after considering the things done and suffered by Romulus, the length of his life, the manner of his death, and all such like matters, he confidently and boldly asserted that Romulus was conceived by his mother in the 1st year of the 2nd Olympiad, at the 3rd hour of the 23rd day of the month, which is called in the Egyptian calendar Khoiak, at which time there was a total eclipse of the sun. He stated that he was born on the 21st day of the month Thuth, about sunrise. Rome was founded by him on the 9th day of the month Pharmuthi, between the 2nd and 3rd hour, for it is supposed that the fortunes of cities, as well as those of men, have their certain periods which can be discovered by the position of the stars at their nativities. The quaint subtlety of these speculations may perhaps amuse the reader more than their legendary character will weary them. When the city was founded, Romulus first divided all the able-bodied males into regiments, each consisting of 3,000 infantry and 300 cavalry. These were named legions, because they consisted of men of military age selected from the population. The rest of the people were now organized. They were called populace, and 100 of the noblest were chosen from among them and formed into a council. These he called patricians, and their assembly the Senate. This word, Senate, clearly means assembly of old men, and the members of it were named patricians, according to some, because they were the fathers of legitimate offspring, according to others because they were able to give an account of who their own fathers were, which few of the first colonists were able to do. Others say that it was from their patrocinium, as they then called, and do at the present day call, their patronage of their clients. There is a legend that this word arose from one Patron, a companion of Evander, who was kind and helpful to his inferiors, but it is most reasonable to suppose that Romulus called them by this name because he intended the most powerful men to show kindness to their inferiors, and to show the poorer classes that they ought not to fear the great nor grudge them their honors, but be on friendly terms with them, thinking of them and addressing them as fathers, patres. For, up to the present day, foreigners address the senators as lords, but the Romans call them conscript fathers, using the most honorable and least offensive of their titles. Originally, they were merely called the fathers, but afterwards, as more were enrolled, they were called conscript fathers. By this more dignified title, Romulus distinguished the Senate from the people, and he introduced another distinction between the powerful and the common people by naming the former patrons, which means defenders, and the latter clients, which means dependents. By this means he implanted in them a mutual good feeling, which was the source of great benefits, for the patrons acted as advocates for their clients in lawsuits, and in all cases became their advisors and friends, while the clients not only respected their patrons, but even assisted them, when they were poor, to portion their daughters or pay their creditors. No law or magistrate could compel a patron to bear witness against his client, nor a client against his patron. Moreover, in later times, although all their other rights remained unimpaired, it was thought disgraceful for a patron to receive money from a client. So much for these matters. In the 4th month after the city was founded, we are told by Fabius, the reckless deed of carrying off the woman took place. Some say that Romulus himself naturally loved war, and being persuaded by some prophecies that Rome was fated to grow by wars, and so reach the greatest prosperity, attacked the Sabines without provocation. For he did not carry off many maidens, but only 30, as though it was war that he desired more than wives for his followers. This is not probable. Romulus saw that his city was newly filled with colonists, few of whom had wives, while most of them were a mixed multitude of poor or unknown origin, who were despised by the neighboring states, and expected by them shortly to fall to pieces. He intended his violence to lead to an alliance with the Sabines, as soon as the damsels became reconciled to their lot, and set about it as follows. First, he circulated a rumor that the altar of some god had been discovered, hidden in the earth. This god was called Census, either because he was the god of counsel, for the Romans to this day call their assemblies concilium, and their chief magistrates consuls, as it were those who take counsel on behalf of the people, or else it was the equestrian Neptune. The altar stands in the greater hippodrome, and is kept concealed except during the horse races when it is uncovered. Some say that, as the whole plot was dark and mysterious, it was natural that the god's altar should be underground. When it was brought out, he proclaimed a splendid sacrifice in its honor, and games and shows open to all men. Many people assembled to see them, and Romulus sat among his nobles, dressed in a purple robe. The signal for the assault was that he should rise, unfold his cloak, and then wrap it around him. Again. Many men armed with swords stood round him, and at the signal they drew their swords, rushed forward with a shout, and snatched up the daughters of the Sabines, but allowed the others to escape unharmed. Some say that only 30 were carried off, from whom the 30 tribes were named, but Valerius of Antium says 527, and Juba 683, all maidens. This is the best apology for Romulus, for they only carried off one married woman, Hersilia, which proved that it was not through insolence or wickedness that they carried them off, but with the intention of forcibly effecting a union between the races. Some say that Hersilia married Hostilius, one of the noblest Romans, others that she married Romulus himself, and that he had children by her. One daughter, called Prima, from her being the firstborn, and one son, whom his father originally named Aeolus, because of the assembling of the citizens, but whom they afterwards named Avilius. This is the story as told by Zenodotus of Troezen, but many contradict it. Among the ravishers, they say, there were some men of low condition who had seized a remarkably tall and beautiful maiden. When any of the nobles met them and endeavored to take her away from them, they cried out that they were taking her to Talasius, a young man of good family and reputation. Hearing this, all agreed and applauded, and some even turned and accompanied them, crying out the name of Talasius through their friendship for him. From this circumstance, the Romans up to the present day call upon Talasius in their marriage songs, as the Greeks do upon Hymen. For Talasius is said to have been fortunate in his wife. Sextius Sulla, of Carthage, a man neither deficient in learning or taste, told me that this word was given by Romulus as the signal for the rape, and so that all those who carried off maidens cried Talasio. But most authors, among whom is Juba, think that it is used to encourage brides to industry in spinning wool, that is, Talasia, as at that time Greek words had not been overpowered by Latin ones. But if this be true, and the Romans at that time really used this word Talasia for wool spinning, as we do, we might make another plausible conjecture about it. When the treaty of peace was arranged between the Romans and the Sabines, a special provision was made about the women, that they were to do no work for the men except wool spinning, and thus the custom remained for the friends of those who were married afterwards to call upon Talasius in jest, meaning to testify the bride was to do no other work than spinning. To the present day the custom remains in force that the bride must not step over the threshold into her house, but be lifted over it and carried in, because the Sabine maidens were carried in forcibly and did not walk in. Some add that the parting of the bride's hair with the point of a spear is done in memory of the first Roman marriage having been effected by war and battle, on which subject we have enlarged further in our treatise on causes. The rape of the Sabines took place upon the 18th day of the month Sextilis, which is now called August, on which day the feast of the Consulalia is kept. The Sabines were a numerous and warlike tribe, dwelling in unwalled villages, as though it was their birthright as a Lacedaemonian colony to be brave and fearless. Yet when they found themselves bound by hostages to keep the peace, and in fear for their daughters, they sent an embassy to propose equitable and moderate terms, that Romulus should give back their daughters to them and disavow the violence which had been used, and that afterwards the two nations should live together in amity and concord. But when Romulus refused to deliver up the maidens, but invited the Sabines to accept his alliance, while the other tribes were hesitating and considering what was to be done, Acron, the king of the Cananites, a man of spirit and renown in the wars, who had viewed Romulus first proceeding and founding a city with suspicion, now, after what he had done in carrying off the woman, declared that he was becoming dangerous, and would not be endurable unless he were chastised. At once he began the war, and marched with a great force, and Romulus marched to meet him. When they came in sight of each other, they each challenged the other to fight, the soldiers on both sides looking on. Romulus made a vow that if he should overcome and kill his enemy, he would himself carry his spoils to the temple of Jupiter and offer them to him. He overcame his adversary and slew him, routed his enemy, and captured his city. He did not harm the inhabitants, except that he ordered them to demolish their houses and follow him to Rome, to become citizens on equal terms with the rest. This is the policy by which Rome grew so great, namely, that of absorbing conquered nations into herself on terms of equality. Romulus, in order to make the fulfillment of his vow as pleasing to Jupiter, and as fine a spectacle for the citizens as he could, cut down a tall oak tree at his camp, and fashioned it into a trophy, upon which he hung or fastened all the arms of Acron, each in its proper place. Then he girded on his own clothes, placed a crown of laurel upon his long hair, and placing the trophy upright on his right shoulder, marched along in his armor, singing a paean of victory, with all the army following him. At Rome the citizens received him with admiration and delight, and this procession was the origin of all the subsequent triumphs and the model which they imitated. The trophy itself was called an offering to Jupiter Ferotrius, for the Romans called to strike ferire, and Romulus prayed that he might strike down his enemy. The spoils were called spolia opima, according to Varro, because opim means excellence. A more plausible interpretation would be from the deed itself, for the work is called in Latin opus. This dedication of spolia opima is reserved as a privilege for a general who has slain the opposing general with his own hand. It has only been enjoyed by 3 Roman generals, first by Romulus, who slew Acron, king of the Cananites, second by Cornelius Cossus, who slew the Tyrrhenian Tolumnius, and above all by Claudius Marcellus, who killed Britomart, the king of the Gauls. Now Cossus and Marcellus drove into the city in chariots and 4, carrying the trophies in their own hands. But Dionysius is in error when he says that Romulus used a chariot and 4, for the historians tell us that Tarquinius, the son of Demaratus, was the first of the kings who introduced this pomp into his triumphs. Others say that Publicola was the first to triumph in a chariot. However, the statues of Romulus bearing the trophy, which are to be seen in Rome, are all on foot. After the capture of the Cananite tribe, while the rest of the Sabines were still engaged in preparation for war, the inhabitants of Fidenae and Christumerium and Antimna attacked the Romans. A battle took place in which they were all alike worsted. For each they permitted Romulus to take their cities, divide their lands, and incorporate them as citizens. Romulus divided all the lands among the citizens, except that which was held by the fathers of any of the maidens who had been carried off, which he allowed them to retain. The remainder of the Sabines, angry at these successes, chose Tatius as their general and marched against Rome. The city was hard to attack, as the capital stood as an advanced fort to defend it. Here was placed a garrison, and Tarpius was its commander, not the maiden Tarpeia, as some write, who make out Romulus a fool, but it was this Tarpeia, the daughter of the captain of the garrison, who betrayed the capital to the Sabines, for the sake of the golden bracelets which she saw them wearing. She asked as the price of her treachery that they should give her what they wore on their left arms. After making an agreement with Tatius, she opened a gate at night and let in the Sabines. Now it appears that Antigonus was not singular when he said that he loved men when they were betraying, but hated them after they had betrayed. As also Caesar said in the case of Remitalces the Thracian, that he loved the treachery but hated the traitor. But this seems a common reflection about bad men by those who have need of them, just as we need the poison of certain venomous beasts. For they appreciate their value while they are making use of them, and loathe their wickedness when they have done with them. And that was how Tarpeia was treated by Tatius. He ordered the Sabines to remember their agreement, not to grudge her what was on their left arms. He himself first of all took off his gold armlet, and with it flung his great oblong shield. As all the rest did the like, she perished, being pelted with the gold bracelets and crushed by the number and weight of the shields. Tarpeus also was convicted of treachery by Romulus, according to Juba's version of the history of Sulpicius Galba. The other legends about Tarpeia are improbable. Amongst them, that which is told by Antigonus, that she was the daughter of Tatius the Sabine leader, abducted by Romulus, and treated by her father as is related above. Similus, the poet, talks utter nonsense when he says that it was not the Sabines, but the Gauls to whom Tarpeia betrayed the capital, because she was in love with their king. His verses run as follows. And near Tarpeia, by the Capitol, that dwelt betrayer of the walls of Rome, she loved the chieftain of the Gauls too well, to guard from treachery her father's home. And a little afterward he speaks of her death. Her did the Boians and the Celtic tribes bury, but not beside the stream of Po. From off their warlike arms their shields they flung, and what the damsel longed for laid her low. However, as Tarpeia was buried there, the hill was called the Tarpeian Hill until King Tarquinius, when he dedicated the place to Jupiter, removed her remains and abolished the name of Tarpeia. But even to this day they call the rock in the capital the Tarpeian Rock, down which malefactors used to be flung. When the Sabines held the citadel, Romulus in fury challenged them to come down and fight. Tatius accepted his challenge with confidence, as he saw that if overpowered his men would have a strong place of refuge to retreat to. All the immediate space in which they were about to engage was surrounded by hills, and so seemed to make a desperate battle necessary, as there were but narrow outlets for flight or pursuit. It chanced also that the river had been in flood a few days before, and had left a deep muddy pool of water upon the level ground where the forum now stands, so that men's footing was not certain, but difficult and treacherous. Here a piece of good fortune befell the Sabines as they heedlessly pressed forward. Curtius, one of their chiefs, a man with reputation for dashing courage, rode on horseback far before the rest. His horse plunged into this morass, and he, after trying to extricate himself, at last finding it impossible, left him there and saved himself. This place, in memory of him, is still called the Gulf of Curtius. Warned of their danger, the Sabines fought a stout and indecisive battle, in which many fell, among them Hostilius. He is said to have been the husband of Hersilia and the grandfather of Hostilius, who became king after the reign of Numa. Many combats took place in that narrow space, as we may suppose, and special mention is made of one, which proved the last, in which Romulus was struck on the head by a stone, and like to fall, and unable to fight longer. The Romans now gave way to the Sabines, and fled to the Palatine Hill, abandoning the level ground. Romulus, now recovered from the blow, endeavored to stay the fugitives, and with loud shouts called upon them to stand firm and fight. But as the stream of fugitives poured on, and no one had the courage to face round, he lifted his hands to heaven and prayed to Jupiter to stay the army, and not to allow the tottering state of Rome to fall, but to help it. After his prayer many were held back from flight by reverence for the king, and the fugitives suddenly resumed their confidence. They made their first stand where now is the temple of Jupiter Stator, which one may translate, "He who makes to stand firm." And then, forming their ranks once more, they drove back the Sabines as far as what is now called the palace and the temple of Vesta. While they were preparing to fight, as though the battle was only now just begun, they were restrained by a strange spectacle, beyond the power of words to express. The daughters of the Sabines, who had been carried off, were seen rushing from all quarters, with loud shrieks and wailings, through the ranks and among the dead bodies, as though possessed by some god. Some of them carried infant children in their arms, and others wore loose their hair and were disheveled. All of them kept addressing the Romans and the Sabines alternatively by the most endearing names. The hearts of both armies were melted, and they fell back so as to leave a space for the women between them. A murmur of sorrow ran through all the ranks, and a strong feeling of pity was excited by the sight of the women, and by their words, which began with arguments and upbraidings, but ended in entreaties and tears. "What wrong have we done to you," said they, "that we should have suffered, and should even now suffer such cruel treatment at your hands? We were violently and wrongfully torn away from our friends, and after we had been carried off, we were neglected by our brothers, fathers, and relatives for so long a time, that now, bound by the closest of ties to our enemies, we tremble for our ravishers and wrongers when they fight, and weep when they fall. You would not come and tear us from our ravishers while we were yet maidens, but now you would separate wives from their husbands, and mothers from their children, a worse piece of service to us than your former neglect. Even if it is not now about us that you began to fight, you ought to cease now that you have become fathers-in-law, and grandfathers, and relatives one of another. But if the war is about us, then carry us off with your sons-in-law and our children, and give us our fathers and relatives, but do not take our husbands and children from us. We beseech you not to allow us to be carried off captive a second time." Hersilia spoke at length in this fashion, and as the other women added their entreaties to hers, a truce was agreed upon, and the chiefs met in conference. Hereupon the women made their husbands and children known to their fathers and brothers, fetched food and drink for such as needed it, and took the wounded into their own houses to be attended to there. Thus they let their friends see that they were mistresses of their own houses, and that their husbands attended to their wishes and treated them with every respect. In the conference it was accordingly determined that such women as chose to do so should continue to live with their husbands, free, as we have already related, from all work and duties, except that of spinning wool, Telesia. That the Romans and the Sabines should dwell together in the city, and that the city should be called Rome after Romulus, but the Romans be called Quirites, after the native city of Tatius, and that they should both reign and command the army together. The place where this compact was made is even to this day called the Comitium, for the Romans call meeting Quirae. Now that the city was doubled in numbers, 100 more senators were elected from among the Sabines, and the legions were composed of 6,000 infantry and 600 cavalry. They also established 3 tribes, of which they named one Rhamnenses from Romulus, another Titienses from Tatius, and the third Lucarenses, after the name of a grove to which many had fled for refuge, requiring asylum, and had been admitted as citizens. They call a grove Lucus. The very name of tribe and tribune shows that there were 3 tribes. Each tribe was divided into 10 centuries, which some say were named after the women who were carried off. But this seems to be untrue, as many of them are named after places. However, many privileges were conferred upon the women, amongst which were that men should make way for them when they walked out, to say nothing disgraceful in their presence, or appear naked before them, on pain of being tried before the criminal court, and also that their children should wear the bulla, which is so called from its shape, which is like a bubble, and was borne round the neck, and also the broad purple border of their robe, praetexta. The kings did not conduct their deliberations together, but each took counsel with his own 100 senators, and then they all met together. Tatius dwelt where now is the temple of Juno Moneta, and Romulus by the steps of the fair shore, as it is called, which are at the descent from the Palatine Hill into the great circus. Here, they say, the sacred cornel tree grew, the legend being that Romulus, to try his strength, threw a spear, with cornel wood shaft, from Mount Aventine, and when the spear had sunk into the ground, though many tried, no one was able to pull it out. The soil, which was fertile, suited the wood, and it budded, and became the stem of a good-sized cornel tree. After the death of Romulus, this was preserved and reverenced as one of the holiest objects in the city. A wall was built round it, and whenever anyone thought that it looked inclined to droop and wither, he at once raised a shout to tell the bystanders, and they, just as if they were assisting to put out a fire, called for water, and came from all quarters carrying pots of water to its place. It is said that when Gaius Caesar repaired the steps, and the workmen were digging near it, they unintentionally damaged the roots, and the tree died. The Sabines adopted the Roman system of months, and all that is remarkable about them will be found in the Life of Numa. But Romulus adopted the large oblong Sabine shield, and gave up the round Argolic shields which he and the Romans had formerly carried. The 2 nations shared each other's festivals, not abolishing any which either had been wont to celebrate, but introducing several new ones, among which are the Matronalia, instituted in honor of the women at the end of the war, and that of the Carmentalia. It is thought by some that Carmenta is the ruling destiny which presides over a man's birth, wherefore she is worshipped by mothers. Others say that she was the wife of Evander the Arcadian, a prophetess who used to chant oracles in verse, and hence surnamed Carmenta, for the Romans call verses Carmina, whereas it is more generally admitted that her right name was Nicostrate. Some explain the name of Carmenta more plausibly, as meaning that during her prophetic frenzy she was bereft of intellect, for the Romans call to lack carcere, and mind mentum. We have spoken before of the feast of the Palilia. That of the Lupercalia would seem, from the time of its celebration, to be a ceremony of purification, for it is held during the ominous days of February, a month whose name one might translate by purification, and that particular day was originally called Febrate. The name of this feast in Greek signifies that of wolves, and it is thought on this account to be very ancient, and derived from the Arcadians who came to Italy with Evander. Still, this is an open question, for the name may have arisen from the she-wolf, as we see that Luperci started to run their course from the place where Romulus is said to have been exposed. The circumstances of the ritual are such as to make it hard to conjecture their meaning. They slaughter goats, and then 2 youths of good family are brought to them. Then some with a bloody knife mark the foreheads of the youths, and others at once wipe the blood away with wool dipped in milk. The youths are expected to laugh when it is wiped away. After this they cut the skins of the goats into strips and run about naked, except a girdle round the middle, striking with the thongs all whom they meet. Women in the prime of life do not avoid being struck, as they believe that it assists them in childhood and promotes fertility. It is also a peculiarity of this festival that the Luperci sacrifice a dog. One Bontes, who wrote an elegiac poem on the origin of the Roman myths, say that when Romulus and his party had killed Amulius, they ran back in their joy to the place where the she-wolf suckled them when little, and that the feast is typical of this, and that the young nobles run, as, smiting all they met that day, from Alba Romulus and Remus ran. The bloody sword is placed upon their foreheads in token of the danger and slaughter of that day, and the wiping with the milk is in remembrance of their nurse. Caius Achilles tells us that, before the foundation of Rome, the cattle of Romulus and Remus were missing, and they, after invoking Faunus, ran out to search for them, naked, that they might not be inconvenienced by sweat, and that this is the reason that the Luperci ran about naked. As for the dog, one would say that if the sacrifice is purificatory, it is sacrificed on behalf of those who use it. The Greeks, in their purificatory rites, sacrifice dogs, and often make use of what is called periskilakismos. But if this feast be in honor of the she-wolf, in gratitude for her suckling and preserving of Romulus, then it is very natural to sacrifice a dog, for it is an enemy of wolves. Unless indeed the beast is put to death to punish it for hindering the Luperci when they ran their course. It is said also that Romulus instituted the service of the sacred fire of the Vestae, and the holy virgins who keep it up, called Vestals. Others attribute this to Numa, though they say that Romulus was a very religious prince, and learned in divination, for which purpose he used to carry the crooked staff called lituus, with which to divide the heavens into spaces for the observation of the flight of birds. This, which is preserved in the Palatium, was lost when the city was taken by the Gauls. But afterwards, when the barbarians had been repulsed, it was found unharmed in a deep bed of ashes, where everything else had been burned or spoiled. He also enacted some laws, the most arbitrary of which is that a wife cannot obtain a divorce from her husband, but that a husband may put away his wife for poisoning her children, counterfeiting keys, or adultery. If anyone put away his wife on other grounds than these, he enacted that half his property should go to his wife, and half to the temple of Ceres. A man who divorced his wife was to make an offering to the Chthonian gods. A peculiarity of his legislation is that, while he laid down no course of procedure in case of parricide, he speaks of all murder by the name of parricide, as though the one were an abominable, but the other an impossible crime. And for many years it appeared that he had rightly judged, for no one attempted anything of the kind at Rome for nearly 600 years. But it is said that the first parricide was that of Lucius Hostilius, which he committed after the war with Hannibal. Enough has now been said upon these subjects. In the 5th year of the reign of Tatius, some of his relatives fell in with ambassadors from Laurentum on their way to Rome, and endeavored to rob them. As the ambassadors would not submit to this, but defended themselves, they slew them. Romulus at once gave it as his opinion that the authors of this great and audacious crime ought to be punished, but Tatius hushed the matter up, and enabled them to escape. This is said to have been the only occasion upon which they were openly at variance, for in all other matters they acted with the greatest possible unanimity. The relatives, however, of the murdered men, as they were hindered by Tatius from receiving any satisfaction, fell upon him when he and Romulus were offering sacrifice at Lavinium, and slew him, but respected Romulus, and praised him as a just man. He brought home the body of Tatius, and buried it honorably. It lies near what is called the Armilustrium, on Mount Aventine. But Romulus neglected altogether to exact any satisfaction for the murder. Some writers say that the city of Lavinium, in its terror, delivered up the murderers of Tatius, but that Romulus allowed them to depart, saying that blood had been atoned for by blood. This speech of his gave rise to some suspicion that he was not displeased at being rid of his colleague. However, it caused no disturbance in the state, and it did not move the Sabines to revolt, but partly out of regard for Romulus, and fear of his power, and belief in his divine mission, they continued to live under his rule with cheerfulness and respect. Many foreign tribes also respected Romulus, and the more ancient Latin races sent him ambassadors and made treaties of friendship and alliance. He took Fidenae, a city close to Rome according to some authorities, by sending his cavalry thither on a sudden, and ordering them to cut the pivots of the city gates, and then unexpectedly appearing in person. Others say that the people of Fidenae first invaded the Roman territory, drove off plunder from it, and insulted the neighborhood of the city itself, and that Romulus laid an ambush for them, slew many, and took their city. He did not destroy it, but made it a Roman colony, and sent 2,500 Romans thither as colonists on the Ides of April. After this, a pestilence fell upon Rome, which slew men suddenly without previous sickness, and afflicted the crops and cattle with barrenness. A shower of blood also fell in the city, so that religious terror was added to the people's sufferings. As a similar visitation befell the citizens of Laurentum, it became evident that the wrath of the gods was visiting this city because of the unavenged murders of Tatius and of the ambassadors. The guilty parties were delivered up on both sides and duly punished, after which the plague was sensibly mitigated. Romulus also purified the city with lustrations, which, they say, are even now practiced at the Ferentin Gate. But before the plague ceased, the people of Camerium attacked the Romans, supposing that they would be unable to defend themselves on account of their misfortune, and overran their country. Nevertheless, Romulus instantly marched against them, slew 600 of them in battle, and took their city. Half the survivors he transplanted to Rome, and settled twice as many Romans as the remainder at Camerium on the calends of Sextilis. So many citizens had he to spare after he had only inhabited Rome for about 16 years. Among the other spoils, he carried off a brazen 4-horse chariot from Camerium. This he dedicated in the temple of Vulcan, having placed in it a figure of himself being crowned by victory. As the city was now so flourishing, the weaker of the neighboring states made submissions, and were glad to receive assurance that they would be unharmed. But the more powerful, fearing and envying Romulus, considered that they ought not to remain quiet, but ought to check the growth of Rome. First, the Etruscans of Veii, a people possessed of wide lands and a large city, began the war by demanding the surrender to them of Fidenae, which they claimed as belonging to them. This demand was not only unjust, but absurd, seeing that they had not assisted the people of Fidenae when they were fighting and in danger, but permitted them to be destroyed, and then demanded their houses and lands, when they were in the possession of the others. Receiving a haughty answer from Romulus, they divided themselves into 2 bodies, with one of which they attacked Fidenae, and with the other went to meet Romulus. At Fidenae they conquered the Romans, and slew 2,000, but they were defeated by Romulus, with a loss of 8,000 men. A second battle now took place at Fidenae, in which all agree that Romulus took the most important part, showing the greatest skill and courage, and a strength and swiftness more than mortal. But some accounts are altogether fabulous, such as that 1,400 were slain, more than half of whom Romulus slew with his own hand. The Messenians appear to use equally inflated language about Aristomenes, when they tell us that he thrice offered sacrifice for having slain 100 Lacedaemonians. After the victory, Romulus did not pursue the beaten army, but marched straight to the city of Veii. The citizens, after so great a disaster, made no resistance, but at their own request were granted a treaty and alliance for 100 years, giving up a large portion of their territory called the Septem Pagi, or 7 districts, and their assault works by the river, and handing over 50 of their leading men as hostages. For his success at Veii, Romulus enjoyed another triumph on the Ides of October, when he led in his train many captives, amongst whom was the Veientine general, an old man, who was thought to have mismanaged matters foolishly and like a boy. On this account to this day, when a sacrifice is made for victory, they lead an old man through the forum and up to the Capitol, dressed in a boy's robe with wide purple border, and with a child's bulla hung round his neck, and the herald calls out, "Sardinians for sale," for the Tyrrhenians or Tuscans are said to be of Sardinian origin, and Veii is a Tyrrhenian city. This was Romulus's last war. After it, he, like nearly all those who have risen to power and fame by a great and unexpected series of successes, became filled with self-confidence and arrogance, and in place of his former popular manners, assumed the offensive style of a despot. He wore a purple tunic, and a toga with purple border, and did business reclining instead of sitting on a throne, and was always attended by the bands of youths called Celeres, from their quickness in service. Others walked before him with staves to keep off the crowd, and were girt with thongs, with which to bind any one of whom he might order into custody. The Latins used formerly to call the bind ligare, and now call it alligare, wherefore the staff-bearers are called lictors, and their staves are called bacula, from the rods which they then carried. It is probable that these officers, now called lictors by the insertion of the C, were originally called litors, that is, in Greek, liturgoi, public officials. For to this day the Greeks call a town hall litus, and the people laus. When Romulus's grandfather Numitor died in Alba, although he was evidently his heir, yet through a desire for popularity he left his claim unsettled, and contented himself with appointing a chief magistrate for the people of Alba every year, thus teaching the Roman nobles to desire a freer constitution, which should not be so much encroached upon by the king. For at Rome now even the so-called fathers took no place in public affairs, but had merely their name and dignity, and were called into the Senate house more for form's sake than to express their opinions. When there, they listened in silence to Romulus's orders, and the only advantage which they possessed over the commons was that they knew the king's mind sooner than they. Worst of all was, that he of his own authority divided the land which was obtained in war amongst the soldiers, and restored the hostages to the Veientines, against the will of the Senate and without consulting it, by which he seemed purposely to insult it. On this account the Senate was suspected, when shortly after he miraculously disappeared. His disappearance took place on the nuns of the month now called July, but then Quintilis, leaving nothing certain or agreed on about his end except the date. Even now things happen in the same fashion as then, and we need not wonder at the uncertainty about the death of Romulus, when that of Scipio Africanus, in his own house after supper, proved so inexplicable, some saying that it arose from an evil habit of body, some that he had poisoned himself, some that his enemies had suffocated him during the night. And yet the corpse of Scipio lay openly exposed for all to see, and gave all who saw it some ground for their conjectures, whereas Romulus suddenly disappeared, and no morsel of his body or shred of his garments were ever seen again. Some supposed that the senators fell upon him in the temple of Vulcan, and after killing him cut his body in pieces, and each of them carried off one in the folds of his robe. Others think that his disappearance took place neither in the temple of Vulcan, nor yet in the presence of the senators alone, but say that Romulus was holding an assembly without the city, near a place called the Goat's March, when suddenly strange and wonderful things took place in the heavens, and marvelous changes, for the sun's light was extinguished, and night fell, not calm and quiet, but with terrible thunderings, gusts of wind, and driving spray from all quarters. Hereupon the people took to flight in confusion, but the nobles collected together by themselves. When the storm was over and the light returned, the people returned to the place again, and searched in vain for Romulus, but were told by the nobles not to trouble themselves to look for him, but to pray to Romulus and reverence him, for he had been caught up into heaven, and now would be a propitious god for them instead of a good king. The people believed this story, and went their way rejoicing, and praying to him with good hope. But there were some who discussed the whole question in a harsh and unfriendly spirit, and blamed the nobles for encouraging the people to such acts of folly when they themselves were the murderers of the king. Now Julius Proculus, one of the noblest patricians and of good reputation, being one of the original colonists from Alba, and a good friend and companion of Romulus, came into the forum, and there upon his oath, in touching the most sacred things, stated before all men that as he was walking upon the road, Romulus appeared, meeting him, more beautiful and taller than he had ever appeared before, with bright and glittering arms. Astonished at the vision, he had spoken thus: "O king, for what reason or with what object have you left us exposed to an unjust and hateful suspicion, and left the whole city desolate and plunged in the deepest grief?" He answered, "It pleased the gods, Proculus, that I should spend thus much time among mankind, and after founding a city of the greatest power and glory, should return to heaven whence I came. Fare thee well, and tell the Romans that by courage and self-control they will attain to the highest pitch of human power. I will ever be for you the kindly deity Quirinus." This tale was believed by the Romans from the manner of Proculus in relating it, and from his oath. Indeed, a religious feeling, almost amounting to ecstasy, seems to have taken hold of all present, for no one contradicted him, but all dismissed their suspicions entirely from their minds, and prayed to Quirinus, worshipping him as a god. This account resembles the Greek legends of Aristeus of Proconnesus, and that of Cleomedes of Estepalea. The story goes that Aristeus died in a fuller's shop, and that when his friends came to fetch his body, it had disappeared. Then some persons who had just returned from travel said that they had met Aristeus walking along the road to Croton. Cleomedes, we are told, was a man of unusual size and strength, but stupid and half crazy, who did many deeds of violence, and at last in a boys' school struck and broke into the column that supported the roof, and brought it down. As the boys were killed, Cleomedes, pursued by the people, got into a wooden chest, and shut down the lid, holding it inside so that many men together were not able to force it open. They broke open the chest, and found no man in it, alive or dead. Astonished at this, they sent an embassy to the oracle at Delphi, to whom the Pythia answered, "Last of the heroes is Cleomedes of Estepalea." And it also related that the corpse of Alcmena, when it was being carried out for burial, disappeared, and a stone was found lying on the bier in its place. And many such stories are told, in which, contrary to reason, the earthly parts of our body are described as being deified together with the spiritual parts. It is wicked and base to deny that virtue is a spiritual quality, but again it is foolish to mix earthly with heavenly things. We must admit, speaking with due caution, that as Pindar has it, the bodies of all men follow overpowering death, but there remains a living spirit, the image of eternity, for it alone comes from heaven. Thence it comes, and thither it returns again, not accompanied by the body, but only when it is most thoroughly separated and cleansed from it, and become pure and incorporeal. This is the pure spirit which Heraclitus called the best, which darts through the body like lightning through a cloud, whereas that which is clogged by the body is like a dull, cloudy exhalation, hard to loose, and free from the bonds of the body. There is no reason, therefore, for supposing that the bodies of good men rise up into heaven, which is contrary to nature, but we must believe that men's virtues and their spirits most certainly, naturally, and rightly proceed from mankind to the heroes, and from them to the genii, and from thence, if they be raised above and purified from all mortal and earthly taint, even as is done in the holy mysteries, then not by any empty vote of the Senate, but in very truth and likelihood, they are received among the gods, and meet with the most blessed and glorious end. Some say that the name Quirinus, which Romulus received, means Mars. Others that it was because his people were called Quirites. Others again say that the spearhead or spear was called by the ancients Quiris, and that the statue of Juno leaning on a spear is called Juno Quiritis, and that the dart which is placed in the Regia is addressed as Mars, and that it is customary to present with a spear those who have distinguished themselves in war, and therefore that it was as a warrior or god of war that Romulus was called Quirinus. A temple dedicated to him is built on the Quirinal hill, which bears his name, and the day of his translation is called the People's Flight, and the None Capritoni, because they go out of the city to the Goat's March on that day to sacrifice, for in Latin a goat is called capra. And as they go to the sacrifice, they call out many of the names of the country, as Marcus, Lucius, Caius, with loud shouts, in imitation of their panic on that occasion, and their calling to each other in fear and confusion. But some say that this is not an imitation of terror, but of eagerness, and that this is the reason of it. After the Gauls had captured Rome and been driven out by Camillus, and the city through weakness did not easily recover itself, an army of Latins, under one Livius Postumius, marched upon it. He halted his army not far from Rome, and sent a herald to say that the Latins were willing to renew their old domestic ties, which had fallen into disuse, and to unite the races by new intermarriage. If, therefore, the Romans would send out to them all their maidens and unmarried women, they would live with them on terms of peace and friendship, as the Romans had long before done with the Sabines. The Romans, when they heard this, were afraid of going to war, yet thought that the surrender of their women was no better than captivity. While they were in perplexity, a female slave named Philotis, or according to some Tutola, advised them to do neither, but by a stratagem to avoid both war and surrender of the woman. This stratagem was that they should dress Philotas and the best looking of the other female slaves like free women, and send them to the enemy. Then at night Philotas said she would raise a torch, and the Romans should come under arms and fall upon the sleeping enemy. This was done, and terms were made with the Latins. Philotas raised the torch upon a certain fig tree with leaves which spread all round and behind, in such a manner that the light could not be seen by the enemy, but was clearly seen by the Romans. When they saw it, they immediately rushed out, calling frequently for each other at the various gates in their eagerness. As they fell unexpectedly upon the enemy, they routed them, and keep the day as a feast. Therefore the nones are called the Capritone, because of the fig tree, which the Romans call Caprificus, and the women are feasted out of doors, under the shade of fig tree boughs. And the female slaves assemble and play, and afterwards beat and throw stones at each other, as they did then, when they helped the Romans to fight. These accounts are admitted by but few historians, and indeed the calling out one another's names in the daytime, and walking down to the Goat's March, seems more applicable to the former story, unless indeed both of these events happened on the same day. Romulus is said to have been 54 years old, and to be in the 38th year of his reign when he disappeared from the world.